Hello, my name is Ryan Grundy, and I'm the lead of Ecosystem Management at Payments Canada. Those of you who know a little bit about us know that we are the owners and operators of the clearing and settlement infrastructure that underpins the Canadian economy, as well as the creators of the rules that define the use of those systems. On top of that privilege, we are also very honored to have the spot in the center of the Canadian payments ecosystem, which allows us to connect and collaborate with leaders across the payments space. Today, our spotlight topic is on open banking, or within the Canadian context, consumer-driven banking. Consumer-driven banking, also known as open banking or consumer-directed finance, refers to frameworks which allow consumers and small businesses to securely transfer their financial data through an application program interface, or API, to approved service providers of their choice. Consumer-driven banking enables consumers to securely use data-driven financial services that can help them better manage their finances and improve their financial outcomes. Across the border on October the 22nd, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, or CFPB, finalized its Personal Financial Data Rights Rule, more commonly known as the Open Banking Rule, under Section 1033 of the Dodd-Frank Act. This landmark regulation aims to empower consumers by granting them greater control over their personal financial data, enabling them to access and share this information with third-party providers securely and without charge. And with these developments taking place in North America, and given that it's Financial Literacy Month here in Canada, it's especially timely for us to bring together our esteemed panelists to talk about the future of open banking. Rather than do little justice to the introductions of our esteemed panel, I'm going to turn it over to them to introduce themselves. And Anna, we'll start with you.
Thanks very much, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be here today. I'm Anna Badour. I'm Senior Director, Legal, Personal Banking, Lending and Wealth at Equitable Bank. Equitable Bank is the seventh largest bank by assets in Canada. We also launched a fully digital bank, EQ Bank, in 2016. Our mission at Equitable is to drive change in Canadian banking to enrich people's lives. And as a result, very aligned with a lot of the policy objectives of consumer-driven banking. And we've been a long-time champion and definitely very supportive of establishing a framework in respect of open banking, aka consumer-driven banking in Canada.
Thank you. Stephen, over to you, please.
Thanks so much, Ryan. My name is Steve Boms. I'm the Executive Director of the Financial Data and Technology Association of North America. FDATA is a global organization with chapters across the world. I lead North America's, and we've seen open banking frameworks developed and implemented in other jurisdictions, including the UK, Europe, Australia, New Zealand. And we've been working over the last almost 8 years now to have regulated open banking frameworks designed and implemented in both Canada and the US. And really excited that we've gotten over the hump south of the border and hopefully getting close north of the border as well. So looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Stephen. Last but not least, Kïrsten.
Thank you, Ryan. So my name is Kïrsten Fraser. I'm the Director of Financial Services Innovation in the Financial Sector Policy Branch at the Department of Finance, Canada. So my team is responsible for the development of the consumer-driven banking framework. And so that is primarily what I've been working on for the last 6 years at the Department of Finance, alongside of my colleagues. And prior to that, I was with the Competition Bureau. Looking forward to the dialogue today. Thank you.
Thank you, Kïrsten. Since you have the microphone open, I think we'll start with you in terms of the
Super.
question set, if that's okay. Many of us in the Canadian space are familiar with consumer-driven banking. It tends to sort of dominate the conference circuit. But I know that perhaps, consumers don't necessarily understand it as well or understand, exactly what it is. So I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about how consumer-driven banking would empower the financial future of Canadians.
When we think about consumer-driven banking, there's sort of 3 drivers. And first and foremost, this is about consumers and their ability to use and move their financial data in ways that benefit them and enable them to improve their financial outcomes. Secondly, it's about security. And so it's about the ability for consumers to do that action in a secure way. We know right now that there is a sizable number of Canadians that are undertaking this activity through screen scraping, so through the sharing of their banking credentials. And that is neither a secure nor efficient way of doing that. And finally, it's about innovation and the continued sort of international competitiveness of Canada's financial sector. And so that innovation really includes the sort of utility to consumers. So what does that mean, sort of from how a consumer's empowered or how a consumer is able to improve their financial outcomes? And, I think really that's only limited by the use cases, right? What we see right now, I think, in the space are things like the use of transaction data to generate credit scores, the use of transaction data, to in loan adjudication, the use of something like transaction data or rental income we see in the marketplace right now as a way to generate a credit score, and certainly these have sort of considerable financial inclusion elements. Obviously there are other sort of vehicles around budgeting, tools around account aggregation that give Canadians a fuller picture. But certainly I would say, the way in which we can think about it is that it is only limited sort of by the use cases. We see these sort of cases that I've referred to right now. And then on the small business side, again, around sort of like more efficient and automated of tasks that you're doing, administrative tasks that are taking place inside of small businesses, again, around sort of loan adjudication and the use of transaction data to do that. But I think certainly, as I say, we're bound only sort of by the use cases that are that will be brought to bear. But these are the ones that we see right now. Thanks.
Excellent, thank you. So it's sort of a blank canvas upon which innovation can spring in order to sort of provide quality of life benefits to Canadians from coast to coast. Excellent, thank you very much. As part of my introduction, I had referenced recent developments south of the border in terms of the CFB's open banking rule, and Kïrsten, you'd alluded to improving Canada's place on the competitive international landscape. So, Steve, this is a question for you. Wondering how Canada's consumer-driven banking framework compares in terms of objectives and projected impacts on consumers and financial institutions relative to the CFPB's open banking rule, which I've referenced earlier.
It's a great question, Ryan. And look, this is a very complex subject area. So I would just say at a high level, there are a lot of similarities in terms of the path of travel in Canada to what the US has now finalized. But there are also some very kind of obvious differences based on the fact that the two markets are very different to one another. For one thing, in the US, you have more than 9,000 different financial institutions that will become data providers under the US regulation. Obviously, the financial institution sector is much smaller and more concentrated in Canada. You in the US already had, before this rule was finalized, more than 100 million consumers that were using a fintech tool. In Canada, our best estimate amongst FDATA members is that's closer to about 7 million Canadians who are using at least one fintech tool today. And so as a result of that, there's kind of different approaches to this. I think the US looks at open banking more in terms of harnessing the competitive power that's already existed in a way that is ubiquitous and equally accessible, regardless of what bank you choose to bank with or what fintech you choose to work with, and that you're protected when you do. In Canada, a lot of the conversation, especially with policymakers, has really focused in on the consumer protection angle and kind of a fear that this is opening Pandora's box and how do we make sure that consumers are protected. And that is obviously important and should not be diminished. But the one thing that I would say as someone who's watched this kind of unfold and be implemented in other jurisdictions, including the US, the competition benefits are really important and should be kind of equally weighted with the consumer protection benefits of moving to these systems as well. And I think that's where there's a little bit of a difference in how it's talked about.
Excellent, thank you. So like so much of what we do, it's sort of the consumer that's the end of it that stands to drive the benefits through reform and innovation. Thank you for the response. Again, in keeping with that theme of the consumer and end user benefits, Anna, how might the frameworks that we referenced earlier affect consumer choice? I mean, especially when you think about accessing a broader range of financial products.
Yeah, I think maybe echoing some of the points that Kïrsten raised earlier in terms of use cases, et cetera. A lot of opportunity in terms of both consumers and small business in comparison shopping, in accessing products that they may not currently be able to access in a convenient way. Some of the terminology we see in other jurisdictions around, consumer data right in Australia or personal financial data right in the US really reinforce that concept of ownership of your own personal financial data and portability, and what does that mean? And similar to number portability in the telecom sector, the idea of having some level of portability of your financial data. And we do see this as both a mid-sized bank, a digital bank, and this issue of it can be sometimes difficult for consumers in particular, small business as well, to access and use their data across multiple services providers. So last year we had, or this year actually, we've had a campaign around second chance, and the idea that EQ and Equitable Bank can be your second bank account. Doesn't have to necessarily be your first, but the idea that consumers should have access to a second bank account that may be better suited to them. And as part of that, look at a lot of the data, and a majority of consumers still had the first bank account that they opened when, the first bank account they opened ever as a child. And there was also a lack of awareness around fees and interest and so on. And so really consumer-driven banking and the framework it creates would really enable a lot more sophisticated choice for consumers and small business as well.
Interesting. And thank you for introducing the terminology around portability. I know that's one that tends to resonate, a lot with consumers, is the data portability element, as well as your reference to the telecom industry. I may be dating myself, but I recall the time if you'd switch providers, you had to change numbers, which meant, starting from scratch, you effectively lose your established identity. So obviously there's benefits that could be derived in the same manner when we're looking at sort of financial services and products. Steve, I know you talked a little bit about, the two jurisdictions when we look at, the United States, and Canada. And there's obviously a lot of talk down the road of, cross-border compatibility, which will be essential as the world grows smaller and smaller. The question for you though, Steve, is, do the CFPB, which is United States, and Canadian government's consumer-driven banking goals align, or are there some noticeable differences that could create a disconnect going forward?
Yeah, Ryan, I think there is complete alignment in the goals. And look, I harbor a dream of global interoperability of open banking frameworks around the world, where if you are an accredited Canadian fintech, you could, for example, easily do business in the UK and offer your product or service to a UK consumer. I think that's quite a way down the road, but I think that's kind of the nirvana for open banking nerds. But I guess, I'm really fond of a metaphor that I know some folks on the call have kind of heard me use before, which is open banking is best contemplated as electricity. And when you think of it in those terms, then the interoperability conversation makes a ton of sense. So what does the average consumer's interaction with electricity in their home look like? They don't know where it comes from. They never really stop to think about it. But they've got plugs in every room in their house. Every different appliance that they want to use fits that plug. And so it's completely interoperable. In the US and Canada, you can bring your appliance with you and plug it in, and it works just fine. If something goes wrong, you know who to call. There are processes in place to make sure that whatever appliance you plug in either jurisdiction doesn't blow up the second that you plug it in. And if God forbid it does, you know what to do. You know how to be made whole. And so kind of thinking about it there as like an infrastructure that underlies kind of the service, the tool, the product that the consumer is working with, I think then you can start thinking about how do you make these things interoperable? How can you structure, for example, the accreditation of a Canadian fintech in the Canadian CDB system? Sorry, I'll say CDB instead of consumer-driven banking just because it's a mouthful. But how can you be as confident as you possibly can that if you can become accredited as a fintech in Canada under the CDB framework, that you will be able to comply with what's required under the US regulation that was just finalized last month? And so I think there's good indications of the beginnings of interoperability, but it's a kind of long road with a ton of complicated legal and cross-jurisdictional issues.
Thanks, Stephen. Obviously, we'll sort of address the domestic opportunity, prior to sort of looking beyond our borders, but definitely appreciate that. As part of your response, you kind of shifted the focus a little bit from the consumer, where we kind of spent the initial part of the conversation, over into the payment industry. And so in order to speak to the open banking nerds that you'd referenced as well in your response, I have a question for Kïrsten. And that is, how will consumer-driven banking impact the Canadian payment industry?
Yeah, great question, Ryan. So thank you for that. I'd want to start by saying that, and I think Steve pointed this out, in Canada, the framework that's being contemplated right now puts us in a read-only world. So that's the ability to see and use the data, but not to initiate actions on behalf of the consumer. So not to initiate payment. There will not be payment initiation contemplated as part of the sort of first phase, legislative phase of consumer-driven banking in Canada. And so what that means is that, there'll be access to, checking, lending, savings, investment accounts and credit accounts, but not to, as I say, initiate payment on behalf of that. We know, I think government knows from observing what's taking place in other jurisdictions that there is value, a fair bit of value in right access. We are watching it as it comes online in other jurisdictions. I think what we have learned, however, from other jurisdictions is about the need to sort of walk before you run. And so that the importance of a phased approach to open banking, consumer-driven banking, is really important. It's fundamental to the success, I think. I think at the same time, as I say, we are watching very closely what's happening in other jurisdictions with payment initiation. And certainly that's something the government's been clear as sort of a next phase contemplation. So really, I think that's, from the payment side, that's what I can say about that. I think we also know that any sort of move to payment initiation has to happen in lockstep with other payment modernization initiatives that are already underway in Canada, such as the RPAA, such as Canada Modernization. And so, I think that those two things have to work together. So that's part of the contemplation that's ongoing right now.
Excellent. Yeah, you'd referenced the sort of interdependency with all the moving parts that are taking place right now in the Canadian payments industry, which is definitely a prevailing theme. In terms of other themes, I know that when we talk about the future of payments, there's always this sort of, dichotomy between payments sort of eventually disappearing, becoming frictionless, becoming seamless, but also in typical Canadian fashion, we place a high premium on safety and security, which is something, you'd alluded to in your answer as well. I'll sort of shift that comment into a question for Anna. So from an industry perspective, do the frameworks that we've been discussing, do they foster enough incentive for innovation, or do you feel as though they may create some barriers?
So certainly they're critical to innovation and frankly critical to competition as well, because, as we've alluded to, there's a lot of necessity to access and sharing of that data in order to build and make available the right products and services to customers. It also takes us away from the idea of having to negotiate bilateral agreements continually, and creates a framework where there can be, essentially a starting point towards innovation. Does it fully get us there? Time will tell. There's certainly a lot of challenges as well, certainly. And again, as we've alluded to, there's the current context of a lot of regulatory change, RPA, et cetera, which would affect a lot of entities that are in this space. So it does help. At the same time, there is a lot of complexity and cost to rolling this out. So all this to say, it does help foster innovation. It's just it's the start of a journey, and it's a complex, expensive, and challenging journey, but one that where we need this essential starting point to start from here.
Thank you very much. I know that complexity has been sort of a hallmark of the prior two responses, and certainly there's a lot going on. But for those of us who've been waiting for innovation to sort of take hold, it's a good problem to have. But we do obviously see more and more emerging players within the Canadian payments ecosystem offering financial services and products to our customers. And obviously, some of the regulatory changes afoot, CP Act for us at Payments Canada, RPAA, which has been referenced as part of this conversation, will only act as a catalyst in terms of sparking even more participation within this space and ultimately more, choice for consumers. The question I have, and this is a question for all of you, and just to sort of give you a heads up, we'll go alphabetically. So Anna, you'll be up first. The question is, what can financial institutions and fintechs and regulators prioritize in order to ensure that there's a smooth rollout of these frameworks? How can we get ready?
I always lose the alphabetical draw, but yes, happy to go first on this. So looking at this question, I think usually there's a lot of discussion around technology and what does it mean. That being said, a lot of the technology already exists. We've got aggregators out there. We've got technology providers that have built solutions, et cetera. And so, yes, it's important to focus on technology, in particular legacy systems, et cetera. But that being said, really probably the main thing to focus on is the actual use cases here and which ones are compelling, which ones are use cases that make sense in a Canadian context. And that is still a bit of an abstract discussion, notwithstanding that we've been at this several years. But it is one that should be driving a lot of this in terms of, what does it mean to smoothly roll this out? And as we, sit and wait for next steps on this, I think that's really where resources and thinking should be prioritized, so that we are ready when the time comes to actually make those use cases available to the right folks. There's also work to be done probably across different stakeholders as well. It's not just financial institutions. Consumers as well need to be educated in this area. There's still a fair bit of lack of awareness on this. And regulators as well are inheriting, a brand new regime that is complex, technical, involves a lot of technological expertise. And so a lot of probably a steep learning curve that many have been already grappling with, but that will continue to be the case as the technology changes quickly as well.
Excellent. Thank you for your response. It's true when you speak to people who aren't as, I guess, familiar with payment-centric subject matter. There does seem to be an opportunity to better articulate a value proposition, in the open banking space. But as we've seen time and time again, often the industry is very adept at sort of meeting unmet demands, and so clearly that's something to keep an eye on as we go forward. Again, keeping with alphabetical, and again, we'll go first name. So if this is sort of an unfamiliar order, Kïrsten, will be you next. And again, just wondering what financial institutions, fintechs, and regulators can prioritize in order to ensure a smooth rollout of the frameworks referenced.
Yeah, so just first, I'd just like to point out, I think that Anna brought up some really, I think, useful pieces around use cases, and also around consumer education, which is really going to be a central part of this, of the preparation for this. In fact, I think what we've seen, sort of, including through successive sort of public opinion research, is that there is a low level of knowledge, a low level of awareness among Canadians about open banking, and often they're using it but don't know they're using it. So so there is a real consumer education piece that I think is the responsibility of both entities and regulators to bring that level of knowledge up, working together. To that end, like in the announcement of the previous budget, there was $1 million set aside for the FCAC. It's sort of a kind of transitional funding as it was moving into its new mandate, and that the goal around that, in addition to kind of preparing for its new responsibilities was also, to fund the development of a consumer education campaign. So that get all of that kind of preliminary work. So the government has been thinking and the regulator has been thinking about that. I think in terms of preparation, and also talked about sort of your technical standards, your security standards. So I think those are things certainly that entities should, and I know many are paying attention to. And I know there's a lot of work around that's happening even within the industry around the technical standard. I think in order to ensure a smooth rollout, I think it's really about the collaborative relationship between the entities and the regulators. And so I think it's about working with each other, one sort of on the entity side to understand what is going to be expected of them, and two, to sort of inform the next steps in the process. And so just for context, obviously the sort of foundational pieces of consumer-driven banking, that being the scope, the technical standard criteria and process, and the governance were introduced in the spring. The next kind of, I would say, tranche of the legislation that includes kind of the path to entry and the ground rules for participation, covering kind of liability, consent, consumer protection, security, and national security, are forthcoming, and we're targeted for the fall. We and the regulator have been working closely with industry on that, and so I think we need to continue that relationship as we move forward, to inform things like the development of regulations and guidance. So that's really what I would see as being the piece that needs to continue to happen on both sides.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Kïrsten. And Steve, you have the unenviable task of sort of wrapping up the common question with your thoughts. So welcome any views that you may have on what financial institutions, fintechs, and regulators can prioritize to ensure that the frameworks roll out smoothly.
Anna, you thought you had the misfortune of going first. I'm not sure that there's much to add from what Anna and Kïrsten said, but I'll try. So maybe just three kind of additional considerations, Ryan. First, all of the industry players need to recognize that the overwhelming majority of Canadian consumers and SMEs feel stress, anxiety, frustration with the current system. Right? And we've commissioned polling on this. I know others have as well. That's not that they feel stress or frustration with their current financial state, although they might. It's with interacting with the financial system. And so there needs to be an improvement, full stop. And there's a role to play for financial institutions. There's a role to play for fintechs. There's a role to play by regulators in correcting for that over time. Second, it will be an adjustment in Canada for fintechs to become kind of federally regulated and to fit into a framework that has oversight from a federal entity and clear criteria that they will have to meet. And so there's some familiarity with that. The RPAA process obviously is rolling out as we speak, and as many as 2,500 different entities will now be registering under the RPAA. And so that's started, but it's a very different tenor between registering for something and becoming accredited under a regulated framework with very stringent criteria for consumer protection. For financial institutions, I would say recognizing that this is not a zero-sum game. I think there's this kind of misconception that somehow the data will always flow data provider, consumer, fintech, when in reality it's the data provider could be a fintech or it could be a financial institution, and the data recipient could be a fintech or a financial institution. And so if you look at other markets across the world that have done this and done this well, what you find is that financial institutions have launched their own technology-based tools that can access data with the consumer's permission and help consumers in myriad ways improve their financial well-being. And so looking at this not just as an additional regulatory burden or a mandate to open up the kind of data at the consumer's consent, but also as an opportunity for the financial institution sector, I think is really important too.
Excellent. I think I love how you framed it there. It's, there's often this sort of well, I mean, regulatory burden is a common term, but realistically, what we are looking at is a regulatory, basically an opportunity that transcends simply, regulatory matters. And I know that, much has been said here about a lot of the complexity associated with the changes taking place within the Canadian payments ecosystem. But, I think we can all honestly say that it's a very exciting time to be a part of it, with all of the changes that are coming down the pipe that ultimately will sort of work towards the benefit of end user consumers and Canadians on the whole, and also compel or propel Canada, I guess, in terms of our position on the competitive international landscape. So I just want to say, on behalf of myself, on behalf of Payments Canada, on behalf of anybody listening, thank you so much, everyone, for the gift of your energy and your expertise today. It's been a fantastic conversation, and look forward to continuing and having more of them at the summit coming up. Thank you very much.